Deliberately I evaded you. I went a different way so I couldn't see you, you couldn't see me. Abu Bakr says, I didn't see you that day. Wallahi al-Azim. Had I seen you, I would have chased you until I killed you. Musab ibn Zubair and his brother Abu Aziz, Musab ibn Umair, my mistake, and his brother Abu Aziz. Abu Aziz was held captive by the Ansar. And when he saw his brother by the Ansar, he had ropes on his hands. He says to the Ansar, tighten the ropes because my mum is very wealthy, she will free him. Abu Aziz says, you know who I am, I'm your brother. Meaning this is a time, show some compassion and sympathy and mercy. Remember those days of our childhood playing football and everything else? He says, Wallahi, this man who has captured you is more my brother than you are. Sa'ad ibn Mu'adh, because of that sacrifice for Allah's sake, who did he become? Imam Muslim relates the hadith and says that on the day that Sa'ad ibn Mu'adh was killed, اهتز لها عرش الرحمن, the arsh of Allah shook. The throne of Allah shook at the death of Sa'ad ibn Mu'adh. Upon occasion, Uhudiyat, our Prophet was given a gift of very fine silk. And the Sahaba, they came, they began to touch the silk, so impressed by the silk. And our Prophet says, أَتَعْجَبُونَ مِنْ هَذِي, he says, you're impressed by that. وَاللَّهِ لَمَنَادِيلُ سَعْدِ ibn Mu'adh فِي الْجَنَّةِ خَيْرٌ مِنْهَا وَأَلْيَنَ. By Allah, the handkerchief of Sa'd ibn Mu'adh in Jannah is softer than that. Abu Sa'id al-Khudri relates, he says, I was one of those who was burying the man. I buried the man. I was one of those who was digging his grave. He says, Wallahi, every layer of soil I dug, I smelled the scent of Jannah. I smelled the scent of paradise. And this is how people became who they became. Like Ibn Qayyim says, قَدْ مَاتَ قَوْمٌ وَهُمْ فِي النَّاسِ أَحْيَا. People of course have died, but with humanity they remain alive. Imam al-Sakhawi says, مَنْ أَرَّخَ مُسْلِمًا أَوْ مُؤْمِنًا فَكَأَنَّمَا أَحْيَاهُ. Whoever relates the story of a believer, it's as if he's given him life. And so our Prophet ﷺ says, لَا تَصُبُّوا أَصْحَابِي. Don't revile and abuse my companions. فَلَوْ أَنَّ أَحَدَكُمْ أَنْفَقَ مِثْلَ أُحُدٍ ذَهَبًا مَا بَلَغَ مُدَّ أَحَدِهِمْ وَلَا نَصِيفًا. Or كما قال, he says, don't abuse and revile my companions, because if one of you gave gold equivalent to Mount Uhud, it wouldn't even compare to a handful of what they gave. Because they gave in the Sa'at al-Usra, in the difficult hour of Islam. They gave when Islam needed them the most. Like Sayyidina Uthman radiyallahu anhu, what a man he was. On the day of Tabuk, when our Prophet ﷺ called the people who will give in the way of Allah, Uthman said, I will give 300 camels for Allah's sake. He sat down. The Prophet says, who will give more than Uthman? Uthman said, I will give 300 more camels in the way of Allah. And he sat down. The Prophet said, who will give more than Uthman? Uthman got up a third time and said, I will give 300 more camels in the way of Allah, laden with food and 1,000 gold dinars. And our Prophet says, Uthman, after today nothing can harm you. After today you have nothing to worry about. Nothing can harm you. But of course these are famous companions. These are famous Sahaba. What about those who are less famous? There was a man called Zahir. He used to sell things on the streets. A very, very poor man. He had his cloth, had his few things, and he would lay the mat on the floor and sell his things. That's his life, that's his existence. And once our Prophet came behind him and he placed his hands around the eyes of Zahir. And he says, Man yashtari hadha al-abd, and who will buy this slave? Who will buy this slave? And Zahir is looking to see who this is, and he sees it's the Prophet. And he says, well then, if I was to go on sale, I'd be very cheap. I wouldn't make much money for whoever sells me. And the Prophet says to him, لَكِنْ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ لَسْتَ بِكَاسِدٍ, but you are not cheap with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You are not cheap with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Think about the case of Julaybib radiyallahu anhu. What an inspiration the man is. And how little we know of him, but how important of the little that we know about him that 1,400 years later we're narrating his story today. The Prophet approached him and says, Julaybib, are you married? Julaybib said, I don't even have any friends, let alone a wife. People hate the way I look. He was dwarfed like in appearance. He said, I don't even have any friends. How on earth am I supposed to get married? The Prophet said, I will marry you off, Julaybib. The Prophet goes to one of the houses of the Ansar, knocks on the door. The man opens the door. He says, I'd like to marry off your daughter. The man is ecstatic. Of course, O Prophet of Allah, we would love our daughter to marry you. He says, no, not for me, for Julaybib. I have to ask the missus. Like people say today, isn't it? I have to ask the missus. And he goes and asks his missus. And he says the same thing. He says, the Prophet is here to marry off our daughter. And she's, oh, yes, of course. Then he says, no, to Julaybib. And she says, never to Julaybib. Look at the example of this wonderful, pious, pure woman who's listening from the other room. And she quotes the ayah and says, when Allah and His Rasul have declared a matter, it's not befitting for any believer to have an opinion in that regard. For if he wants me to marry Julaybib, I will marry Julaybib and no harm shall come from this marriage. And he marries Julaybib off to this woman. The next time we hear of Julaybib, Imam Muslim relates, our Prophet is asking after a ghazwa, he says, هَلْ تَفْقِدُونَ مِنْ أَحَدٍ? Are you missing anyone? To his companions. قَالُوا نَعَمْ فُلَانًا وَفُلَانًا وَفُلَانًا. We missed this person, that person, that person. He says, هَلْ تَفْقِدُونَ مِنْ أَحَدٍ? Are you missing anyone? قَالُوا نَعَمْ. They say, yes we are. فُلَانًا وَفُلَانًا وَفُلَانًا. This person, that person, that person. He says a third time, هَلْ تَفْقِدُونَ مِنْ أَحَدٍ? They said, La. They said, no. That's it. We're not missing anyone. He says, وَلَكِنِّي أَفْقِدُ جُلَيْبِيبٍ. But as for me, I miss Julaybib. Go and find him. Go and find the man. They went to try and find the man. They found this, no words to express the man. Giant is the best word I can come up with, unless you have a better one. Lying on the floor. He had killed 7, he himself was killed. The Prophet was brought, he looked upon Julaybib. He says, قَتَلَ سَبْعَةً ثُمَّ قَتَلُوهُ هَذَا مِنِّي وَأَنَا مِنْهُ هَذَا مِنِّي وَأَنَا مِنْهُ. He killed 7, then he was killed. I am from him, he is from me. I am from him, he is from me. None of us have that stamp of approval by Allah's Rasul. None of us. However handsome you may be, or pretty you may be, or wealthy you may be, this man who was dwarfed like in appearance had a stamp of approval by Allah's Rasul. Now that's something, isn't it? That's something. فَوَضَهُ عَلَى سَاعِدَيْهِ لَيْسَ لَهُ لَسَرِيرًا إِلَّا سَاعِدَ النَّبِيُّ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وسلم. He picked up Julaybib in his arms. And the narrator says that Julaybib had no pillow on that day except the arms of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And none of us have that privilege either. Ibn al-Qayyim says, one of the Salaf says, he said, Shattan bayna qawmun. He says, what difference, look at the difference between a people, mawta, فَأْحْيَا الْقُلُوبُ بِذِكْرِهِمْ. A people who have died but whose remembrance brings life to the hearts. And a people who are alive and whose company brings death to the hearts. And this is important for us to remember. Upon occasion, our Prophet ﷺ was ascending Mount Uhud. Imam Muslim relates and says that فَرَجَفَ بِهِمْ. The mountain began to shake with them. And the Prophet says, إِثْبُتْ Uhud, be firm, O Uhud, فَإِنَّمَا عَلَيْكَ نَبِيٌّ, because on you is a prophet. وَصِدِّيقٌ وَشَهِدَانٌ, upon you is